The reading of the settlement took place in the small library at Ansford Court on a wet afternoon in the October of 1836, in a room that smelled of coal smoke and cold paper, and the particular staleness that gathers in a house where no one has been happy for a long while. And Cordelia Straiton, who had been Cordelia Tarrant, and who had been a widow for 109 days, sat in a hard chair near the window, with her hands folded in her lap, and her morning gloves buttoned to the wrist, listening to a lawyer read aloud the whole of what remained to her in the world. She was 23. She had been married 2 years and 1 month. She had come into that family with £6,000 of her own money, honestly got and honestly given, and she was going out of it with a green lane and a wall. And she was about to hear those two things read out in the flat, incurious voice of a man from Gray's Inn, who had not once looked her in the face since he entered the room. The lawyer was called Pethering, of the firm of Pethering and Slade, and he had the settled, well-fed calm of a man who has spent 40 years explaining to people why they are to receive less than they had expected, and he read the schedule with a small dry pause before each item, as though he were handing over plate at an inventory. There was the messuage or dwelling house known as Sallow End, being of stone, with its garden, its pump, its outbuilding, and its half-acre of orchard ground. There was the ancient cartway, known as Sallow Lane, described in the deed as leading from the highway at Wexley Bar in a northerly direction to the common land at Cranbeck Edge, of the length of 1,180 yards, and of the width of 27 feet between the walls thereof. There was the boundary wall upon the northern side of the said lane, of dry stone, of the length of 900 yards, together with the soil under the same. And there was an annuity of £60, payable half-yearly at Lady Day and at Michaelmas, chargeable upon the general estate, and free of all deductions save the property tax. That was the whole of it. Pethering let the paper fall a little, and said, in the tone of a man closing a drawer, that this concluded the schedule of the widow's provision, and that the residue of the marriage settlement had been made good in other directions in accordance with the wishes of the late Lord Crispin's family, and that he did not think there was anything further requiring the lady's attention that afternoon. It was then that the Dowager Duchess spoke, and it was then that the phrase was made which would follow Cordelia through the next 4 years of her life and out the other side of them. Augusta, Dowager Duchess of Ansford, was seated by the fire with a small dog upon her knee and a shawl of black Chantilly lace across her shoulders, and she had listened to the whole reading without once altering the pleasant, faintly amused set of her mouth. And when Pethering had finished, she looked across at her dead son's wife, with an expression of great and gentle kindness, and observed that it was a mercy, really, that the girl had been provided for at all, since she had brought nothing into the family but a little money and a great deal of ambition, and that a lane and a wall were quite as much as anybody could reasonably have looked for. A lane and a wall. She said it lightly, almost affectionately, in the way that the very great are able to say the very cruel, and the 2 other women in the room laughed, because it was the sort of thing at which one laughed, and because they had been waiting some months for permission to laugh at Cordelia, and had at last received it. Lady Sibylla Straiton, the Duke's sister, laughed longest of all, and then said that she supposed Cordelia might let the grazing of the lane to a cottager, and be perfectly comfortable upon the proceeds. And the phrase went out of the library that same evening, carried by the servants, down to the still room, and out to the stables, and along the Wexley Road to the village. And within a fortnight it had reached the market town. And within a month there was not a house in the 100 where the young widow of Ansford was not known as the woman who had married a duke's brother, and got a lane and a wall for her pains. Cordelia said nothing at all. This surprised the room. They had expected tears, or a spirited little speech, or one of those brittle declarations that young women make when they have been humiliated in company, and instead she sat quite still and looked at the folded schedule in the lawyer's hand as though she were reading it through the paper. And after a moment she asked, in a voice so ordinary that it seemed almost impolite, whether she might have a copy of the schedule made out for her own keeping, together with a copy of the plan referred to in the third recital. Pethering blinked. He said that a copy could be furnished at her own expense. She said that she would pay for it, and that she would be glad if the plan were drawn to the same scale as the enclosure award, and that if the award plan was kept in the estate office, she would be grateful to be allowed an hour to look at it. There was a small silence at that, of the kind that occurs when a person who has been quietly placed in a category steps briefly outside of it, and the Dowager Duchess stroked her dog and remarked that the girl had always had a taste for maps, a taste which she supposed had been inherited from her father, who had been, she believed, some manner of measuring man. Cordelia agreed that her father had been some manner of measuring man. Then she rose and thanked the lawyer for his trouble, and went out of the library and up the great stair to the blue bedroom that had been hers for 2 years, and would be hers for 11 days more, and she sat down upon the edge of the bed in her wet boots, and did not weep, because she had done the whole of her weeping at Naples in the spring, and there was none of it left. What she did instead, that night, by a single candle, was to take out the copy of the schedule, which Pethering had grudgingly caused to be made, and read it 4 times over, and then take a sheet of writing paper and rule it into columns, and set down at the head of the first column the words that had been said to her downstairs, a lane and a wall, and underneath them, in her father's small clear surveyor's hand, which she had been taught before she had been taught to sew, the 2 questions that her father had asked of every parcel of ground he had ever measured in the whole of his working life. Where does it go? And who else can get there? She did not know that night what the answers would be. She knew only that a lane is not a lane because somebody has called it one, but because it goes from somewhere to somewhere else, and that a wall is not an ornament but a boundary, and that a boundary is a legal fact and not a picturesque one, and that in all the long insolence of that afternoon nobody in the room, not the lawyer, not the dowager, not the Duke's sister, had troubled to ask either of the 2 questions at all. They had looked at the schedule and seen a joke. She looked at it and saw a description of a thing upon the ground, and she had been taught by a man who spent his life with a chain and a level and a field book that a description of a thing upon the ground is never a joke, whatever the people in the drawing room happened to be laughing at. The house was very quiet. Rain went along the window in long slants, and somewhere below her a door was shut and bolted for the night, and she thought of her husband, who had been kind to her and weak, and who had died at Naples of a fever that a stronger man would have thrown off in a week, and who had promised her, in the last coherent hour that he had, that she should have Ray Farm and the Nether Hollands land, 420 acres between them, and £340 a year, which was what the settlement had said when it was drawn and read over to her before the wedding, and which was not what the settlement said now. She had heard those words read out in that same room in the September of 1834, with her uncle beside her, and the sun coming through the south window, and a bee going stupidly up and down the glass, and she remembered them exactly, because she had been trained from childhood to remember descriptions of land. Now the schedule said Sallow End and Sallow Lane, and 900 yards of dry stone wall, and Pethering had said that the residue had been made good in other directions in accordance with the wishes of the family, and nobody had offered her any explanation of how a settlement executed before witnesses in one form had come to be operative in another. She understood perfectly well that she would be given no explanation. She understood, also, that she was not going to ask for one, because the asking would be the entertainment they wanted, and because a woman with £60 a year and no relations of consequence does not fight a duke's family in the year 1836 by making scenes in libraries. She would fight them, if she fought them at all upon the ground. That was where her father had fought everybody who had ever tried to lie to him, and he had never once lost, because the ground does not care who your people are. The candle burned down to a stub and began to smoke. Cordelia folded her ruled sheet of paper and put it inside the cover of her father's field book, which was the only object of value she had carried into the marriage that she was permitted to carry out of it, and she laid the book at the bottom of her trunk beneath her linen, and she blew out the light. 11 days later she left Ansford Court in a hired chaise with 2 boxes and a hamper, and nobody came down to the door to see her go except a housemaid who had liked her, and she was set down at 4 o'clock in the afternoon at the foot of a green lane on the Wexley Road, in front of a small stone house with a broken gutter and a garden gone entirely to nettles, and the carrier put her boxes upon the step and touched his hat and drove away. She stood in the failing light and looked up the lane that had been given to her as a joke. It went straight up the hill for 2/3 of a mile between 2 old walls, straight and level and wide, wider by a good deal than the turnpike itself, and it disappeared over the shoulder of Cranbeck Edge into a grey November sky, and Cordelia Straighten, standing at the foot of it, with the rain beginning again, thought that whoever had built a way like that had not built it for the convenience of cottagers, and that men do not lay out 27 feet of stone-walled road across a hillside in order to carry 2 sacks of turnips down to a market town. To understand why a young woman standing in the rain at the foot of a green lane should have looked up it and thought about the width of the road rather than about the injustice done to her, it is necessary to go back some 20 years, to a low white house at the edge of the market town of Wexley, and to a man named Nathaniel Tarrant, who was Cordelia's father, and who was, as the Dowager Duchess had so accurately and so contemptuously put it, a measuring man. Nathaniel Tarrant had begun life as the son of a saddler, and had ended it as the most trusted land surveyor in 3 counties, and the whole of the distance between those 2 positions had been covered on foot, with a chain over his shoulder and a field book in his pocket, across something over 1,100 parishes' worth of English ground. He had come up in the great age of enclosure, when the open fields and the commons and the wastes of half the kingdom were being surveyed, valued, divided and allotted by Act of Parliament. And when a man who could carry a straight line across broken country and write a description that would stand up in a court of law, could earn a comfortable living, and, if he were honest, an unassailable reputation. Tarrant had been honest. It was said of him in the trade that he had twice refused work from great men because they had wanted the line run where the line would not go, and that on one celebrated occasion he had told a baronet's steward in front of witnesses that the hedge in question had been in the same place since before the baronet's family had been heard of, and that he proposed to measure it where it stood rather than where it was wanted. He was not a clever man in the way that lawyers are clever. He was something rarer, which was a man who could not be persuaded to write down a thing that was not so. Cordelia was his only child. Her mother, Alethea, had died of a low fever when the girl was 6, and Nathaniel Tarrant, having no notion what else to do with a daughter, had simply taken her with him. From the age of 7 she went out in the gig with her father on fine days, sitting among the ranging rods and the offset staffs and the tin case that held the theodolite, and she learned before she was 10 to hold the end of a Gunter's chain steady in a wind, to read a levelling staff, to book the notes in the double column with the offsets left and right, and to keep her mouth shut in the presence of gentlemen who were pretending to be interested in accuracy. By 12 she could plot a traverse. By 14 she could compute an area by the method of latitudes and departures without a single blot. And her father, who was not given to compliments, had begun to hand her the fair copies of the smaller plans to letter, because her hand was better than his, and because clients liked a plan that looked well. She grew up, in short, with an unusual and entirely unfashionable education. Other girls of her station were taught the globes and a little French and the harp. Cordelia Tarrant was taught that the world consisted of parcels, that every parcel had a boundary, that every boundary had a history, and that the history was written down somewhere, in a parish chest or a manor court roll, or the enrolled award of an enclosure commissioner, and that whoever knew where it was written down, and whoever had troubled to read it, possessed an advantage over everyone else concerned that no amount of rank could take away. It is a strange education for a girl in the 1820s. It made her at 18 a young woman of very quiet manners and a disconcerting habit of exactness, and it made her at 23 standing at the foot of Sallow Lane with 2 boxes and a hamper on the step behind her, the single most dangerous person in the county to the interests of the Duke of Ansford, although neither she nor the Duke nor anybody else yet had the faintest idea of it. Her father died in the spring of 1832 of a chill taken on a survey of drowned meadows in the Lyde Valley, and he left her £11,000. This astonished everybody except his clerks. He had lived plainly all his life in the low white house. He had kept 1 gig and 1 horse, and he had put every fee he earned into the funds and into 2 mortgages on good farmland, and the effect of 40 years of that was a fortune of a size that made the Wexley attorneys revise their opinion of the surveying profession. 6,000 of it was tied up as Cordelia's marriage portion under her mother's settlement. The remainder came to her outright at his death, and of that remainder she had, by the autumn of 1834, already lost the greater part, not by extravagance, but by the ordinary means through which unprotected young women lost money in that decade. which was to say a bank at Wexley, that stopped payment in the panic. An uncle who invested £3,000 for her in a South American mining concern that turned out to consist of a prospectus and a hole, and the expenses of a lawsuit brought against her father's estate by a disappointed claimant which she won, and which cost her £400 to win. By the time she was 21, she had her £6,000 of settled money, some £800 loose, her father's instruments, his library of some 90 volumes on surveying, drainage, law of highways, and the practice of the enclosure commissioners, and 41 field books covering 38 years of work. She kept the field books. Everything else could be sold, and most of it eventually was, but the field books she kept, and it was in the 14th of them, though she did not know it in 1834, and would not find it until the January of 1839, that the whole of her fortune lay waiting for her in her father's handwriting. Her uncle, a comfortable and unimaginative wine merchant named Barnaby Oak, who was in fact not her uncle at all but her father's oldest friend and her appointed trustee, took her to Bath in the winter of her 21st year, because he believed, quite sincerely, that a young woman with £6,000 and no living relations ought to be got married before somebody worse than a mining promoter found her. It was at Bath, at a subscription ball in the February of 1834, that she met Lord Crispin Straiton. He was the younger brother of the 6th Duke of Ansford. He was 29. He was extremely handsome in the light, wasted way that consumptive men often are, and he was, though nobody said so aloud in the ballroom, entirely without money. The Ansford dukedom in that generation was a magnificent shell. It carried 3 great houses, 22,000 acres, a barony in abeyance, and a mortgage of £140,000, and the 6th Duke, Roland Straiton, had inherited the whole apparatus at the age of 26, along with a settled conviction that the family's difficulties were a temporary embarrassment which would be resolved by somebody else. His younger brother Crispin had a life interest in nothing at all, an allowance of £600 a year which was frequently in arrear, and a chest that would not carry him past 40. What Crispin had instead of money was a real and unaffected sweetness of temper. He was the only member of that family who had ever in his life gone out of his way to be kind to a person who could not repay it. And when he found himself standing beside a quiet, grey-eyed young woman at the edge of a Bath ballroom, who answered his idle question about the view from Beacon Cliff by telling him the height of it above the river to the nearest 3 feet, he laughed until he had to sit down, and then asked her how she knew, and then listened for 40 minutes to the answer. Cordelia had never in her life been listened to for 40 minutes by anybody but her father. That was, in truth, the whole of the courtship. He came to see her, and she talked, and he listened, and he brought her ridiculous small presents, a paper of sugared almonds, a print of a bridge at Bristol, a second-hand copy of a treatise on the construction of roads by a Scotch engineer which he had bought because the title made him think of her, and which she read 3 times. In the April he asked her to marry him, in the sitting-room of the lodgings in Gay Street, with Barnaby Oak pretending to read a newspaper in the corner, and he told her honestly that he had nothing, that his family would be disagreeable about it, that his lungs were not what they should be, and that he had no business asking her at all. and Cordelia, who had been alone for 2 years, and who had discovered in the previous 8 weeks what it was to be liked, said that she would. She was not a fool, and she was not romantic in the way of the circulating libraries. She knew what her £6,000 meant to a family in that condition, and she knew that she was being married in part for it. What she believed, and what was in fact true, was that Crispin himself was not marrying her for it. He would have married her with nothing. It was everybody else in his family who required the £6,000, and it was everybody else in his family who set about, from the moment the engagement was announced, arranging the settlement in such a way that the £6,000 should be secured to the estate, and that the young person from Wexley should be given, in exchange for it, whatever the family could most easily spare. Barnaby Oak, who as trustee had the duty of protecting her, fought them for 3 months. He was a wine merchant, and they were the Duke of Ansford's men of business, and the contest was about as equal as such contests usually are. But he was stubborn, and he was not stupid, and by the August he had extracted terms that were, upon paper, entirely respectable. The £6,000 was to go into the settlement trust. In consideration of it, the trustees of the Ansford estate were to convey to the use of the said Cordelia Tarrant for her life, in the event of her surviving her husband, the freehold farm called Ray Farm in the parish of Hallowbrook, containing 260 acres, together with the lands called the Nether Hollands, containing 160 acres, the two together being of the annual value of £340, and there was in addition a jointure of £100 a year, and the use of the house called Sallow End. Oak had that in draft, engrossed, and read over in the small library at Ansford Court, in the September of 1834, in the presence of Cordelia, her intended husband, the Duke, the Dowager Duchess, and 2 clerks. Cordelia remembered the bee on the window glass. She remembered the sunlight, and the smell of the beeswax on the table, and she remembered the description of Ray Farm because descriptions of land were the thing she had been trained to remember, and she remembered thinking, with a small, warm, private satisfaction that she was ashamed of afterwards, that her father would have approved of the acreage. What she did not do, because she was 21 years old and about to be married, and because she trusted the man who had spent 3 months fighting for her, was read the final engrossment of the deed as executed on the day of the wedding. Nobody does. That is precisely why it is done. They were married on the 14th of September, 1834, in the parish church at Hallowbrook, and the Duke gave a breakfast for 40 people at which the bride was addressed twice and looked at a great deal, and the Dowager Duchess wore grey and said afterwards, to a woman who repeated it, that the girl had at least the sense to be quiet. Cordelia herself remembered very little of the day, except that Crispin's hand had been cold, and that he had squeezed hers 3 times during the service, once at the beginning, once in the middle, and once at the end, as though marking off the stages of a journey he was pleased to be making. They had 2 years. It is not much, and yet it was the happiest and most ordinary time of her life, and when she came afterwards to weigh what the family had taken from her, she never once counted those 2 years among the losses, because they had not been able to touch them. The young couple were given the east wing at Ansford Court, 3 rooms and a small stair, because there was no money to establish them anywhere else, and there they lived on Crispin's 600 a year, which was paid at the Duke's convenience, and was consequently paid late, and on what remained of Cordelia's loose money, and they were, in the main. Content, Crispin read aloud badly and with great enjoyment. Cordelia mended her own stockings and kept the accounts and walked, in all weathers, for miles. They discovered together that he had never once in his life been shown how anything was made, and she took him to see a lime kiln drawn, and a field under-drained with horseshoe pipe, and a section of the turnpike relayed, and he stood in the rain, with his hat pushed back, and asked questions like a boy of 11, and came home and coughed for 2 days, and said it had been the best afternoon of his life. In the second winter he was ill for 11 weeks. In the spring of 1836 the physician said Italy, in the way that physicians of that generation always said Italy, and the Duke, who had a genuine if shallow affection for his brother, and who found the presence of an invalid in the house depressing, produced with unusual promptness £400 for the journey. They went by Paris and Lyons and over the Mont Cenis in a diligence, and Cordelia, who had never been out of England, sat beside her husband with a shawl over his knees and looked at the Alps and thought, with the incurable habit of her upbringing, about gradients. Crispin was better at Nice and better again at Genoa, and at Naples in the April he was so far recovered that they walked out twice to look at the excavations, and he bought her a coral brooch from a man on the Chiaia for 11 shillings. And then, in the second week of May, he took a fever that had nothing to do with his lungs at all, an ordinary Neapolitan fever of the kind that killed strangers every summer, and in 9 days he was dead. He was 31. She buried him in the English cemetery outside the walls, and she paid for the stone herself out of the money that remained, and she sat by the grave for an hour on the morning she left, and that was the last of her weeping. She came home overland with a courier she could not really afford, and a maid she had hired at Marseille, and she arrived at Ansford Court on the 22nd of July, 1836, in the black clothes she had bought in Italy, and the first thing the Duke said to her, in the hall, before he had said anything else at all, was that they must have a talk about the settlement when she was rested. She had not expected that. She had expected at the very worst a cold and formal grief. What she had not expected was that the family's first sentence to her should be about money, and she understood in that moment, standing in the hall with her travelling cloak still on, and the smell of the sea still in her hair, that she was no longer a member of the household, but an item of unfinished business. The talk about the settlement was postponed 4 times and finally took place in the October, and it took the form of the reading in the small library which has already been described. What had happened in between was not complicated, and Cordelia worked out the whole of it within a fortnight of leaving Ansford, not because anybody told her, but because she had a copy of the schedule and a memory trained upon descriptions of land. The draft settlement of the August of 1834 had conveyed to her, for life after her husband's death, Ray Farm and the Nether Hollands. The settlement as executed on the morning of the wedding had conveyed to her Sallow End, Sallow Lane and the north wall thereof. The 2 documents were in every other respect identical, in their recitals, in their covenants, in their appointment of trustees, in the clause for the £60 annuity, which had in the draft been £100, and in the engrossment was 60. Somebody had reset the second schedule. It was, as a piece of work, contemptibly simple. The draft had been read over in September to a girl of 21 and her wine merchant trustee. The engrossment had been executed on the morning of the 14th in a vestry at 9:30, with the bride's carriage waiting at the gate, and the bride's trustee sitting in the second pew, with his gloves and his hat, and it had been handed to Barnaby Oak by a clerk of Pethering and Slade, who had said that it was as agreed, and Barnaby Oak had turned to the execution page and had looked at the parcels clause on the first sheet and had seen the words Ray Farm, which were in fact there, in the recital of the trustee's powers, describing land out of which the estate covenanted to make good any deficiency. And he had signed. He had been 58 years old, and he had been fighting professional men for 3 months, and he had believed he had won. And on the morning of a wedding he had glanced at a page and signed. Cordelia never reproached him for it. Not once, in all the years that followed, did she say a single word to Barnaby Oak about that signature. And when he came to her in the November of 1836 at Sallow End, with his hat in his hands and his face grey, and tried to tell her that he would sell his business and make it good to her, she stopped him before he had finished the first sentence, and told him that if he ever mentioned it again, she would not receive him, and then gave him tea, and asked him whether he still had the correspondence with Pethering and Slade from the summer of 1834. He had. That was the second most valuable thing she was to acquire in the whole affair, and she acquired it because she had chosen, in a moment when almost any other woman would have raged, to be kind to an old man. She kept the letters in a tin box. There were 61 of them. Whether the substitution had been the Duke's own doing, or the Dowager's, or the invention of Pethering, or simply the ordinary drift of an estate office in which everybody understood what was wanted and nobody had to be told, Cordelia never learned with certainty and eventually ceased to care. Her own settled opinion, formed early and never afterwards revised, was that the Dowager Duchess had wanted it, that Pethering had done it, and that the Duke had been told about it afterwards and had been relieved. Rowland Straiton was not a cruel man. He was something which in the management of great property is a good deal more destructive than cruelty, which was a man of 40 who had never once in his life had to find out whether a thing he wanted was possible. Everything had always been arranged. Money had always appeared, late and insufficient and accompanied by the disagreeable faces of lawyers. But it had appeared. It had never seriously occurred to him that a fact might exist which would not eventually give way if he continued to want it to. That single defect of character, and not any wickedness, was to cost him in the end rather more than the whole of Cordelia's £6,000. The 11 days between the reading and her departure were spent packing, and in one other activity which nobody in the house noticed. On the third of those days, Cordelia went down to the estate office in the stable court and asked the under-steward, a mild young man named Kell, who had always been civil to her, whether she might see the enclosure award plan for the parish of Hallowbrook, since her schedule referred to it. Kell, who had received no instructions whatever about the widow, and who saw no reason to refuse a bereaved lady the sight of a map, brought out the great linen-backed sheet and unrolled it upon the table and weighted the corners with 4 brass weights, and left her alone with it for an hour and a half. She did not copy it. She had no time and no proper paper, and in any case she did not need to copy the whole of it. What she did was to find the strip of ground that was now hers, which was numbered on the plan as parcel 214, and to read the reference table at the side of the sheet against that number, and to write down in the back of her father's field book, in pencil, in her small, clear hand, the exact words that the commissioners had used in 1798, which were not the words that Pethering had used in the schedule. Pethering had written, "The ancient cartway known as Sallow Lane." The award had written, "One public and private carriage road and driftway of the breadth of 27 feet, called Sallow Lane, leading from the turnpike road at Wexley Bar, unto the quarries and getting grounds upon Cranbeck Edge, the soil and freehold of the same being hereby allotted, and awarded unto the owner for the time being of the messuage called Sallow End, subject to the rights hereinafter mentioned. Unto the quarries and getting grounds upon Cranbeck Edge." She read that clause 4 times, standing at the table in the estate office with the rain on the skylight, and then she closed the field book and put it in her pocket and thanked Mr. Kell and went back to her packing. And she said nothing to anybody. And she went on saying nothing to anybody for 2 years and 3 months. Sallow End had been empty for 11 years when Cordelia moved into it, and the state of it was a message in itself, since the estate had had 11 days' notice of her coming, and had sent nobody to open a window. It was a stone house of 4 rooms and a scullery, built about 1760 for the man who had managed the getting grounds on the edge in the days when they were worked, and it stood at the very foot of Sallow Lane, where the lane met the Wexley Turnpike, gable end to the road, with its door opening not onto the highway but into the lane, which was a detail she noticed on the first evening and thought about a great deal afterwards. The roof was sound. The gutter on the north side had gone, and the wall beneath it was green to the sill. There was a rook's nest in the parlour chimney, a dead jackdaw in the kitchen grate, and in the small back room, a quantity of stacked and forgotten estate lumber, 3 broken hurdles, a corn bin, and a great deal of mouse-eaten sacking. The garden was a wilderness of nettle and elder. The pump worked, which was the one mercy, and the pump worked because a lane is a public way, and the parish had kept the pump in order for the carters. She spent her first night in a chair with her cloak over her, because the bedstead was down and she had not the strength that evening to put it up, and in the morning she went out at first light with a bill-hook she found in the outbuilding, and cut a path from the door to the pump, and then she went back in and lit a fire, and that was the beginning of it. She had £60 a year, a little under £300 of loose capital, no carriage, no manservant, and a 16-year-old daughter of a Hallowbrook cottager named Hetty Manders, who came at £3 a year, and her keep because her mother had known Mrs. Tarrant and would not see the surveyor's girl live alone. £60 a year in the year 1836 in a country parish was not destitution. It was a curate's second income. It meant that she could eat, that she could keep a fire in one room, that she could have her boots mended, and that she could not do one single thing more, and that any accident whatever, an illness, a broken window, a rate demand, would have to be met by selling something. Cordelia had been the mistress of 3 rooms in a ducal house, and she had been dressed by a woman who came from Bath. She now learned to bank the fire with the small coal that fell from the carts on the turnpike, and to keep hens, and to make her own black dye out of logwood chips, because a widow must be in black, and black cloth is dear, and to walk the 4 miles into Wexley Market rather than pay a shilling for the carrier. She learned these things in 11 weeks, and she never afterwards forgot them, and it is worth saying plainly that they did not humiliate her. What humiliated her was something else entirely, And it came in the 2nd week, when the Reverend Amos Whiteley's wife called upon her, in a bonnet, in a gig, with a basket, and looked at the nettles and the green wall and said, with a sweetness that came off her like scent, that she thought it so brave of dear Lady Crispin to make the best of a lane and a wall. It had reached the vicarage in a fortnight. It reached the market town before Christmas. There was a shopkeeper in Wexley who kept her waiting 20 minutes over a paper of pins for the pleasure of it, and there was a farmer's wife at the January fair who asked her, in the hearing of 6 people, how the wall was doing, and there was, worst of all, a young man of good family at the Wexley Assembly in the February who came up to her, quite drunk, and told her that he had heard she was the richest woman in the county in stones. She went home from that assembly and did not go to another for 3 years. The estate did nothing to help her, and, to be exact, the estate did nothing at all, which was in its way remarkable. Her £60 came at Lady Day and at Michaelmas, and it came late both times in the first year, 23 days late at the first, and 40 at the second. And when she wrote a civil note to the estate office, she received a civil note back regretting the delay. Nobody from Ansford Court called upon her. Lady Sibylla, driving into Wexley, passed the end of the lane twice a week for 3 years, and never once turned in. The Duke, so far as Cordelia could ever discover, did not think about her from one year's end to the next, and this was not a policy, but simply the truth. And it was the single greatest strategic advantage she possessed, though it took her a long time to see it. They had put her down in a hole, and had ceased to look into the hole, and consequently they had no idea what she was doing at the bottom of it. What she was doing from the first week of her residence was measuring. She began the wall on the 29th of November, 1836, because it was a dry day and because she could not bear to sit in the house. The wall ran along the north side of the lane for 900 yards, from a stone gatepost near the house to a heap of fallen stone at the top where the lane came out onto the edge, and it was dry stone of the local gritstone, 4'6" high, with a course of through stones at 3 feet and a coping of upright slabs, and it was, she saw at once, a very old and very good wall, better built than any of the enclosure walls in the surrounding fields, which were the hasty work of the 1790s. She paced it. Then she measured it properly with a line, in 33-yard lengths, over 4 afternoons, and booked the results in the back of a field book, and computed that if the wall were 4'6" high, and averaged 20 inches through, and were built at the usual reckoning of a ton to the cubic yard and a half for dry stone work, there were something in the neighborhood of 1,400 tons of stone standing in her wall. She wrote that figure down and looked at it for a long time. 1,400 tons. Somebody had quarried, dressed, carted, and laid 1,400 tons of gritstone to make a boundary along a lane in an unimportant corner of an unimportant parish, and that somebody had not done it for the amusement of it. She walked the lane next, from end to end, 22 times that winter. And she read the lane as her father had taught her to read a piece of made ground. It was not a track worn by use. It was constructed. Under the turf, where a cart wheel had cut through in a wet place, there was a pitched bottoming of set stones on edge, the old Scotch method, with a binding of smaller stuff above it, and the crown of the way was cambered, and there were side drains beneath the walls on both sides, choked with a century of leaf mold but there. And at the third bend there was a culvert of 2 flat slabs over a spring, and the slabs had been dressed with a punch. Cordelia knelt in the mud in her black skirt in the January of 1837 and put her hand on the tool marks of that culvert and understood, with a coldness that ran all the way up her arms, that she was standing on a work of engineering that had been laid out by a professional at considerable expense along the shortest practicable line between the turnpike and the top of Cranbeck Edge, and that the whole purpose of it was written in the award in 6 words that the Duke of Ansford's lawyer had not troubled to copy out. Unto the quarries and getting grounds. She said nothing. This is the part of the history that people find hardest to credit, and it is nevertheless the plain truth. Cordelia Straiton knew by the February of 1837 that she owned the soil and freehold of a made carriage road running to the top of a stone edge, and she did nothing about it for 2 years. Because she was not a fool. There were no quarries working on Cranbeck Edge in 1837. There had been 100 years before, and there were the old getting grounds up there under the heather, a series of shallow shelves and spoil banks and a ruined crane bed, and there was no reason on earth why anybody should open them again, because the stone was good but the country was poor, and there was no market within 20 miles that could not be more cheaply supplied from the quarries at the canal. A right-of-way to a place nobody wants to go is worth precisely nothing. She knew that better than anybody. She also knew, being her father's daughter, 2 further things. The first was that the value of a right-of-way is not fixed, but waits, and that ground does not change, but the world around it does, and that a man who owns the only door into a room owns nothing at all until somebody wants to come in, and everything the moment they do. The second was that if she went to the Duke of Ansford in 1837 and told him what she had found, he would take it from her within the year. She had no money for law. She had £60 and an old man's letters in a tin box, and the family that had already rewritten one deed at their leisure would have found some means, an exchange, a purchase at a valuation of their own fixing, a stopping-up order obtained from 2 justices at quarter sessions on the ground that the way was disused and burdensome to the parish, and that last was the real danger, and she thought about it for a long time. 2 justices could stop up a public highway on a certificate that it was unnecessary. The justices in that division sat at Wexley, and one of them was the Duke's cousin. So she kept her mouth shut. She went on living on £60 a year at the foot of her lane, and she let the parish go on thinking her a curiosity. And she did 3 things, quietly and steadily for 2 years, while the world moved towards her. She read. She wrote letters, and every single week, in all weathers, she walked the whole length of Sallow Lane from the gatepost to the edge and back, because a public and private carriage road that is not used may be presumed abandoned, and a track along which the owner of the soil walks every week of her life for 2 years in front of witnesses. Cannot the old men were the first things she found, and she found them because she was poor. A woman with a carriage never learns a parish. A woman who walks 4 miles to Wexley Market on a Tuesday and 4 miles back with a basket learns within a single winter. Every gate that swings badly, every dog that barks, and every man over 70 who sits on a wall in the sun with nothing to do but tell an interested listener what the country was like before. The chief of these, and the most valuable, was a carter named Tobias Lound, who was 81 in the spring of 1837, who had lost the sight of one eye and the use of 2 fingers, and who had begun work at 9 years old, leading a horse. Cordelia fell into the way of stopping at his door on her Tuesdays, because he had once helped her lift a basket, and she took to bringing him a screw of tobacco which she could not really afford, and he took to talking, and out of that arrangement, which cost her about 11 shillings a year, she got the oral history of Sallow Lane going back to the 1760s, which no lawyer in England could have bought for £100. Lowndes' father had carted stone off Cranbeck Edge. The workings had gone down, he said, when he himself was a lad, on account of the canal opening at Fairwater and the Duke's grandfather losing interest. But before that there had been 4 getting places along the edge and a crane, and better than 30 men, and the stone had all come down Sallow Lane, because there was nowhere else for it to come down, and there never had been anywhere else, and there never would be, and he said this last with the flat certainty of a man who had spent 60 years finding out where a loaded cart will and will not go. He remembered the toll. That was the detail that made Cordelia set down her basket in the road. There had been a bar at the foot of the lane in his father's time, he said, a chain and a post and a little house. And the man at Sallow End had taken the money, 3p the ton for stone and a penny the ton for lime. And there had been trouble about it once when a Wexley man tried to go up without paying, and the man at Sallow End had put a wagon across the mouth of the lane and kept it there for 11 days until the Wexley man paid. She asked him whether he was sure of the 3p. He was quite sure of the 3p, because his father had grumbled about it every day of his working life, and because a man remembers what was taken off him. Cordelia went home and wrote that down, and dated it, and signed it, and the next week she took it back and read it over to Lound in the presence of his daughter, and asked him to make his mark upon it, which he did, and she paid the vicar's clerk a shilling to witness it. She was 24 years old. She had at that point no lawsuit, no prospect of one, and no reason to suppose there ever would be one, and she took a signed and witnessed statement from a man of 81 about a toll gate that had been taken down in 1794, because her father had told her when she was 11 that the cheapest evidence in the world is the evidence you take before anybody knows you want it. Tobias Lound died in the November of 1838. The statement, with his mark upon it and the clerk's attestation, was read in a court of law 14 months later, and it was one of the 3 documents that broke the Duke of Ansford, and it had cost her 11 shillings of tobacco, and a shilling to the clerk, and a great deal of patient listening on cold afternoons. There were others. Ned Tarver the blacksmith at Wexley Bar, who was 50 and who had shod the horses of the last carts off the edge as an apprentice, remembered the ruts and the weight, and remembered his master saying that the lane was made ground and not to be cut about. An old woman at Hollowbrook called Peg Sowerby remembered being sent up the lane with her father's dinner, and remembered the gate at the top. And there was the Reverend Amos Whiteley, who was not old and not a witness to anything, but who was the incumbent of Hollowbrook and the keeper of the parish chest, and who was the second door Cordelia opened. She opened it by the simple means of being useful. The vicar of Hollowbrook was an amiable, overworked and hopelessly disorganized man of 45, with a wife who despised his parish, and £320 a year, and in the spring of 1837 he was in difficulties over the commutation of the great tithe, which under the new act required an apportionment, which required a map, which required a survey of every field in the parish, which the commissioner's assistant was pressing him for, and which he had no more idea how to prepare than how to fly. Cordelia, who had been booking survey notes since she was 10, offered to help him with the schedule of apportionment. She spent 11 weeks on it. She computed the areas of 462 parcels, checked the plan against the enclosure award, found 9 discrepancies and corrected them, wrote the whole fair copy in her own hand, and would take no payment for any of it. And at the end of it the Reverend Amos Whiteley, who had been prepared by his wife to find her a designing woman, would cheerfully have gone to the stake for her. He also gave her, without ever being asked directly, the run of the parish chest. The parish chest at Hallowbrook was a great iron-bound oak box in the vestry with 3 locks and 190 years of paper in it, and nobody had emptied it since 1811. Cordelia emptied it in the August of 1837, over 9 days, kneeling on the vestry floor with a candle and a slate, and she sorted the whole of it into bundles, and labelled them and made a list, which is in the parish records to this day. And among the churchwarden's accounts and the settlement examinations and the bastardy bonds and the militia lists, she found 3 things that mattered. The first was the Surveyor of Highways account book for the years 1781 to 1804, containing 11 separate entries for work done upon Sallow Lane. The culvert, the side drains, the repair of the pitching after a flood, and in each of those entries the lane was described as a carriage road, and in 2 of them as the quarry road. The second was a bundle of vestry minutes from 1792 to 1796 concerning the enclosure of the Commons of Hallowbrook, in which the parish had petitioned the commissioners to have the way to the edge set out as a public carriage road, and had been answered that it should be so set out, and that the soil should be allotted to the owner of Sallow End with a reservation of the public right of passage, which was precisely what the award of 1798 then did. And the third at the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of sacking and stuck together at one corner with damp, was a skin of parchment 2 feet by 18 inches, written in a crabbed 17th century secretary hand, and dated the 11th year of King Charles, being an award of the homage of the manor of Cranbeck made in the year 1631, in which it was found and presented by the jury that there was, and time out of mind had been 1 cartway of the breadth of 9 yards leading from the high street called the Wexley Way unto the Delphs, and getting places upon Cranbeck Edge, and that all men might use the same paying to the Lord's tenant at Sallow End for every wain of stone the accustomed toll. 9 yards, 27 feet. The same width, to the foot, that the commissioners had awarded 167 years later, and that Pethering had copied without thinking into the schedule of a widow's provision in 1836. And Cordelia sat back on her heels on the vestry floor, with the candle guttering and the parchment across her knees, and laughed aloud for the first time since Naples. A short, unlovely bark of a laugh that frightened a bat in the roof. Time out of mind. The lane was older than the family that had given it to her as a joke. It was older than the dukedom, older than the enclosure, older than the turnpike, older than the house she had been thrown out of, and its width and its purpose and the toll upon it had been sworn to by a jury of husbandmen in the year 1631, and the whole of it was lying in a damp box in a vestry that the Duke of Ansford's family had endowed and never once looked into. She did not steal the parchment. She thought about it, and rejected it, and did instead the thing that was both honest and immeasurably more useful, which was to ask the Reverend Amos Whiteley to have the whole contents of the chest properly listed and calendared, and to sign the list as incumbent, and to lodge a duplicate of the list with the diocesan registry at the visitation. It cost him 2 guineas. It meant that the existence, the date, and the contents of that parchment were on a record kept in another county, attested by a clergyman, more than a year before anybody at Ansford Court had the least reason to want the parchment to disappear. Cordelia went home along the lane in the dusk of that 9th August evening, and stopped where she always stopped, at the third bend by the culvert, and looked up the straight-made way to the notch on the skyline where it came out onto the edge, and she said aloud, to nobody, that she wanted nothing to happen. She meant it. She was not in the summer of 1837 plotting a revenge. She had no expectation whatever that stone would ever again be got on Cronbeck Edge, and if she had been offered at that moment £300 for the lane by an honest purchaser, she would have taken it and been glad. What she had was not a plan. What she had was a complete and documented knowledge of a fact, held in reserve in a country where nobody else had troubled to find the fact out, and she was content to hold it, and go on making logwood dye and keeping hens, and she would very likely have gone on doing so for the rest of her life, if in the January of 1838 a company of gentlemen in Nottingham had not decided to build a railway. The Trent and Ambersby Railway was one of the smaller children of the mania, projected in the autumn of 1837 by a committee of Nottingham hosiers and Derby bankers to carry coal, lime and passengers 41 miles across country to a junction with the Midland lines, and its act received the royal assent in the June of 1838 after a committee stage in which the promoters spent £9,000 and the opposing landowners spent rather more. Nothing about it was remarkable except one thing, and the one thing was the crossing of the Lyde Valley. The engineer, a hard, courteous, exhausted Northumbrian, who had trained under the great men of the northeastern lines, had refused from the first to take the railway round by the head of the valley, because the detour was 7 miles and the gradients would have crippled the working of the line for a century, and he had proposed instead to carry it straight across the flood plain on a viaduct of 24 arches, each of 45 feet span, standing at the deepest point 92 feet above the summer level of the river. The Culverton Viaduct, as it came to be called, was to be built of stone throughout, faced with dressed ashlar and hearted with rubble, because brick in that district was dear, and because the engineer, who had seen a brick viaduct go down in a frost in 1831, would not have it at any price. The specification called in round figures for 120,000 tons of stone to be delivered to the works within 3 building seasons, 40,000 tons a year. It is worth pausing upon that figure, because it is the hinge of the entire history, and because the men who calculated it in a Nottingham counting house in the spring of 1838 had never heard of Sallow Lane, of Cordelia Straiton, or of the Duke of Ansford, and would have been astonished to learn that their arithmetic was about to make a poor widow in a four-roomed house, the equal of a peer of the realm. 40,000 tons a year is a number that means nothing until it is turned into carts. A good cart with 2 horses on a made road carried, in that country and that decade, between 30 and 3,500 weight of stone, which is to say 1.5 tons, and could make 4 journeys a day over a distance of 3 miles. 40,000 tons therefore meant something over 26,000 loaded cart journeys in a year, or, spread across the 260 working days that the weather allowed, better than 100 loaded carts every day, from March to November, for 3 years along one road. That is what the railway wanted, and that is what the contract was worth. And the contract, when it was let in the September of 1838, was worth to the supplier of the stone the sum of £41,000. The Duke of Ansford heard about the viaduct in the March of 1838 from his cousin Fenwick Straiton, who sat for a borough and had been on the committee of the bill, and he heard about it at exactly the moment in his life when he needed most urgently to hear about something of the kind. The mortgage stood at £146,000. The rents had been falling for 4 years. He had 2 daughters to portion, a son at Christ Church, with a genius for debt, a roof at Ansford Court which the surveyor had condemned in 1836, and which had not been touched since, and an income which, after the interest was paid, came to rather less than the vicar of Hallowbrook supposed him to spend on candles. And now here was a company of tradesmen proposing to spend £41,000 upon gritstone, in a district where the only gritstone worth the name lay along the top of Cranbeck Edge, and where the whole of Cranbeck Edge, some 1,100 acres of moor and rock and heather, belonged, without question or division or the smallest ambiguity, to the Duke of Ansford. He went up to look at it in the April. It is on record, from the reminiscences of the under-steward Kell, that the Duke of Ansford had never in his life stood upon the top of Cranbeck Edge before that morning, and that he asked, upon arriving, which way they had come, and was told, and did not attend to the answer. They had come up the shepherd's track from Hobbs Moss on horseback, 3 miles of peat and rush, because it was the way the keeper knew. The Duke looked at the old getting grounds, and at the clean grey faces of rock where the 1760s had left off, and at the sample of stone that the mineral surveyor had knocked off with a hammer, and he was told that the bed was 11 feet thick, that it was free from vents, that it dressed beautifully and weathered to a fine silver colour, and that there was, by the roughest estimate, upwards of 2,000,000 tons of it standing in the edge. He is said to have laughed, and to have observed that the family had been sitting on it for 400 years. Within 10 days, he had written to the contractors. Within 6 weeks, he had agreed heads of terms. Within 4 months, in the September of 1838, the Duke of Ansford executed a contract with the firm of Beckwith and Sons of Nottingham, contractors for the Culverton Viaduct, by which he undertook to deliver at the works, or to the wharf at Fairwater for water carriage thence, 120,000 tons of gritstone in the 3 years 1839, 40 and 41, at a price of 6 shillings and 10 the ton delivered, and the contract contained, as such contracts always contain, a clause providing for liquidated damages at the rate of £200 for every month, by which the deliveries in any season should fall short of the quantity specified. He signed it in London on the 11th of September. He signed it, and this must be said plainly because the whole tragedy of the man is in it. Without having sent any person whatever to survey the route by which 120,000 tons of stone were to be brought down off the top of an 800-foot escarpment. He had seen a hill full of stone and a company willing to buy it, and the intervening question, the question of how, had presented itself to his mind as a matter of detail to be arranged by employees, in the same way that the question of how the fish arrived at his table was a matter to be arranged by employees. The Duke of Ansford was not a stupid man. He was a man to whom the physical world had always been delivered. That autumn the estate spent £1,900 at Cranbeck. They built a road up from the Moss, or began to. They bought 2 cranes and a quantity of iron rail and 11 wagons. They engaged a quarrymaster from the Derbyshire lime country, a heavy, capable, foul-mouthed man named Josiah Braith, who arrived in the October with 8 men and by Christmas had 40, and who took off the overburden along 400 yards of the edge, and had 3 faces open and working by the middle of February. The stone was everything the surveyor had said. Braith sent down 4 blocks to Nottingham in the December, at very great trouble and expense, dragged on sledges through the peat by 11 horses, and Beckwith and Sons pronounced themselves delighted, and the local paper printed a paragraph about the enterprise of the noble Duke and the prospect of employment for the district. And there was a dinner at the Ansford Arms in Wexley, at which the health of the House of Straiton was drunk 7 times. And in the January of 1839, with the first deliveries due at the works in the 2nd week of March, and £200 a month of damages beginning to tick behind them, the Duke of Ansford's people came at last to the question of how the stone was to be got from the top of the edge to the turnpike. And it was discovered that nobody, in the whole of the preceding 10 months, had ever actually driven a loaded cart down off Cranbeck. Braith found it out first, in the way that practical men always find such things out, which is by trying. He put 4 tons on a wagon at the 2nd face on the 11th of January and sent it down the new road towards Hobbs Moss with the best team on the ground, and a driver who had been carting stone for 20 years, and it went 400 yards and sank to the axles in peat, and it took 9 horses and the better part of a day to get it out, and Braith stood in the rain, looking at the trench it had cut, and swore for a full minute without repeating himself, and then walked the whole of the ground himself from end to end, 3 times, in 3 days, and came down to the estate office at Ansford on the 15th, and told the steward that there was one road off that hill, that there had always been one road off that hill, and that it was the old walled lane at the west end that came down to the turnpike at Wexley Bar. The steward said that the estate would have the use of that, of course. Braith said that he was glad to hear it, because without it they might as well throw the cranes over the edge and be done. And the steward, being a careful man who had been in the office 11 years, and who had a memory for parcels, went to the plan chest and took out the enclosure award plan of the parish of Hallowbrook, and unrolled it upon the table, and weighted the corners with 4 brass weights, and looked at parcel 214, and read the reference against it in the schedule at the side of the sheet, and then sat down rather suddenly in the chair by the window, and said nothing for some considerable time. The Duke of Ansford was told on the 19th of January, 1839, and he did not believe it. This is worth dwelling upon, because it was not obstinacy and it was not arrogance in the ordinary sense. It was a genuine inability of the mind. Roland Straiton stood in his own estate office, with the enclosure award plan spread upon the table under 4 brass weights, and he looked at the long pale strip of parcel 214 running up the hillside between its 2 hatched walls, and he heard his agent say that the soil and freehold of it had been conveyed away by the family itself in the widow's settlement, and his response was to ask, twice, in the tone of a man who has been told something absurd, whether Grieve was seriously suggesting that the Duke of Ansford could not use his own road. Grieve said that it was not his Grace's road. The Duke said that of course it was his road, that it ran from his quarry across his hillside to the turnpike, that his family had built the wall, that his grandfather's men had carted stone down it, and that whatever a clerk might have written into a schedule 3 years ago, the notion that a strip of grass in the middle of the Hallowbrook estate belonged to Crispin's widow was a technicality which the lawyers would dispose of in a fortnight. Grieve said that he hoped so. The lawyers did not dispose of it in a fortnight. Pethering came down from London on the 26th and spent 2 days with the deeds and the award and the plan, and on the 28th of January, 1839, in the small library at Ansford Court, in the same room and very nearly in the same chair, the man who had drawn the schedule was obliged to explain to the Duke of Ansford what the schedule said. He explained it badly, and at great length, and with a quantity of Latin. The substance of it was that the parcel had been described in the settlement as the ancient cartway, known as Sallow Lane, of the length of 1,180 yards and of the width of 27 feet, together with the wall and the soil under the same. That the words together with the soil had been put in as a matter of common form to prevent any question about the wall, that the conveyance had passed the freehold of the entire strip, and that it had done so because the family had wished in 1834 to find something of no value whatever to substitute for 420 acres of good farmland, and had gone through the estate looking for the most worthless thing they owned, and had chosen a green lane going up to some disused quarries on a moor. Pethering did not put it in those words. The Duke, who was not a fool where his own interest was concerned, put it in those words himself, aloud, and then sat looking at the fire for some time. His sister Lady Sibylla, who was present, said that the whole thing was ridiculous, and that Cordelia would never dare. The Dowager Duchess, who was also present, said nothing at all for a while, and then observed that the girl had spent an hour and a half with the award plan in the estate office in the October of 1836, and that she had asked for it herself, and that she remembered thinking at the time that it was an odd thing to ask for. There was a silence after that which nobody in the room enjoyed. What they decided upon, in the end, was the worst possible course, and they decided upon it for the reason that families of that kind almost always decide upon the worst possible course, which is that it postponed an unpleasant conversation. They decided to say nothing to her. They would not write. They would not call. They would not open a negotiation which would inform her that she had something worth negotiating about. They would send for a surveyor and find another way down off the edge, and if no other way could be found, they would simply begin carting in the march, as though the question had never arisen, on the footing that the road had always been used, and that possession was 9 points of the law, and that a woman with 60 pounds a year would think a very long while before going to law against a duke. It was, in the circumstances, a defensible gamble. It failed for a reason none of them could have guessed at, which was that the woman with 60 pounds a year did not go to law against a duke. She kept a tally book for 6 months, and then sent in a bill. The steward's name was Halstead Grieve, and he had been land agent to the Ansford estate for 11 years, and he was in every particular the sort of man such estates produce. He was 54, he was able, he was underpaid. He had a wife and 5 children in a good house at the gate, and his entire professional existence consisted in finding ways to give his employer the thing his employer had already decided to have. He had never once in 11 years told the Duke of Ansford that a thing could not be done. He was not going to begin in the January of 1839 over a green lane belonging to a widow with 60 pounds a year. And so, what he did, having sat by the window for some considerable time, was to write 2 letters. The first was to the Duke, and it said that there was a question as to the ownership of the soil of the old quarry road, that the matter was in hand, and that his Grace need give himself no concern. The second was to a mineral surveyor in Sheffield named Ellis Wren, and it asked him to come over at his early convenience and lay out a line of road from the workings on Cranbeck Edge to the turnpike or to the Fairwater Wharf, avoiding the parcel marked in red upon the enclosed tracing. Ellis Wren was 31 years old and had been in practice for himself for 4 of them. He was the son of a Chesterfield ironmonger. He had served 5 years' articles with a colliery viewer. He had walked the whole of the West Riding coalfield with a level. And he had the 2 qualities that made such men indispensable in that decade, and made them, very often, poor. He was extremely good at his work, and he would not sign a plan he did not believe. He arrived at Wexley on the Sheffield coach on the 22nd of January, 1839, with a level, a chain, a case of instruments, 1 carpet bag, and a boy to carry the staff. And he put up at the Ansford Arms and went out at 8 the next morning in a fog. And it is at this point that Cordelia Straighten, who had spent 2 years and 3 months saying nothing whatever to anybody, comes back into the history. She met him on the 4th of February, in her own lane at the third bend by the culvert, in circumstances of great absurdity. He had spent 12 days on the ground by then, and had formed the opinion, which he had not yet reported, that the whole enterprise was in serious difficulty, and he had come down the walled lane on foot with his boy and his staff to take a series of levels along it, having decided that whatever the parcel marked in red might turn out to be, he was not going to write a report about alternatives to a road he had not measured. He was doing this in a driving sleet. He had set the level up at the third bend, and the wind had blown the tripod over into the ditch, and he was on his knees in the mud with the water running off the brim of his hat, feeling for a brass screw in 6 inches of leaf mold, when a woman in black, with a basket and a sack over her shoulders, knelt down beside him without a word, and began to feel for it too, and found it in about 90 seconds, and handed it to him, and said in a perfectly level voice that if he wished to level up a made road, he would do better to run his line along the crown and not along the ditch. Since the crown was cambered 9 inches and the ditch was silted, and would give him a false fall of a foot in 100, and make the whole gradient look worse than it was. Ellis Wren remained upon his knees in the mud and looked up at her. She was, he said long afterwards, the most extraordinary object he had ever seen in his life. A young woman with a dead pheasant's feather in a soaked black bonnet, holding a basket of turnips and a brass leveling screw, in a lane in the middle of nowhere in a sleet storm, using the phrase "a false fall of a foot in 100" as easily as another woman would have said good morning. He asked her when he had got up who she was. She said that she was the owner of the lane. He said that he had understood the lane to belong to the Duke of Ansford. She said that a great many people understood that, including the Duke of Ansford, and that they were all mistaken, and that the parcel he had been instructed to avoid was number 214 upon the enclosure award plan of Hallowbrook, and that if he came to Sallow End at the foot of the hill, when he had done she would give him tea and show him the award and the plan, and that he might make what use of them he pleased, provided only that he showed her his own levels afterwards. Then she picked up her basket and walked away down the lane in the sleet. Wren stood in the road and watched her go, and then, being a professional man with a report to write, went down to Sallow End at 4 o'clock. He stayed until 9. What passed in that kitchen, over a small fire and a very great deal of weak tea, was the meeting of the only two people in the county who were capable of understanding the situation, and it must be said that on that first evening neither of them behaved in the least romantically. They worked. She put the schedule, the award transcript, her own transcript of the 1631 manorial finding, the highway surveyor's account book which the vicar had let her borrow, and the signed and witnessed statement of the late Tobias Lownde upon the table in that order. And he read the whole of it in silence in 1 hour and 10 minutes, and then he asked her 9 questions, of which 7 were about drainage. And then he took out his own field book and laid it open beside hers, and they compared the levels. His fall from the edge to the turnpike, taken along the crown as she had recommended, was 1 in 23 at the steepest, and 1 in 31 over the average, which is to say a road that a 2-horse cart could take loaded and could climb empty without a second team. The alternative he had been sent to find was by that 4th of February 3 alternatives, and he had already levelled 2 of them, and knew that both were bad. He told her so, that evening, sitting at her kitchen table, in flat professional language, and without the smallest consciousness of betraying his employer, because he did not consider that he was employed to keep secrets about the shape of the ground from the owner of it. Then he asked her what she meant to do. Cordelia said that she meant to do nothing at all. She said it while pouring more water on the same leaves. She said that the lane was a public carriage road, and that she could not and would not stop the public from using it. That anybody in England might drive up it tomorrow with a cart and a horse, and she could not lift a finger to prevent them. And that this was perfectly right, and she had no wish to prevent them, and that what the Duke of Ansford could not do, and what no amount of public right could give him, was to take 120,000 tons of stone across the freehold of a road he did not own, by an occupation of it amounting to a trade and not to a passage, without the consent of the owner of the soil, and that the accustomed toll upon that road, sworn to by a jury of the manor in 1631, and remembered by a carter who had died the previous November, was 3d the ton. Ellis Wren put down his cup. He did the arithmetic in his head, because he was the kind of man who does arithmetic in his head. And it took him about 4 seconds, and then he sat back in the chair and said, quite quietly, 40,000 tons a year at 3p a ton is £500 a year. And Cordelia Straighten, who had eaten bread and dripping for her dinner that day, and who had turned the same black dress twice, folded her hands upon the table, and agreed that that was so. Ellis Wren's report to the Duke of Ansford is dated the 2nd of March, 1839. It runs to 19 folio pages with 3 plans and a book of levels. It cost the estate 42 guineas, and it is one of the most beautifully hopeless documents ever produced by an English surveyor, because it consists of a man explaining, with perfect courtesy and in immovable detail, that the thing his employer has already contracted to do cannot be done in the manner his employer intends. Wren examined 4 routes. He examined them properly, which is to say he levelled every one of them from end to end and computed the earthwork. And he set down the quantities and the estimated cost in a table on the 18th page. And it is that table which finished the Duke. The first route was the northern line, over Hobbs Moss, which was the way the estate had already begun, and upon which it had already spent £1,100. It left the workings at the second face, and ran 3 1/4 miles northeast across the moss to strike the Wexley Turnpike above Marchant's Ford. It had 2 vices, and either of them alone would have been fatal. The first was the peat. The moss was, by Wren's soundings, which he took at 41 places with an iron rod, between 4 and 19 feet deep over the whole of its extent, upon a bottom of blue clay, and a road carried across such ground for 100 loaded carts a day would have to be a floated road upon a raft of brushwood and stone, in the manner of the great turnpikes across Chat Moss, and he estimated the cost of it, at the width required for 2 carts to pass, at £4,100 a mile, or £13,300 for the whole, with an annual maintenance he declined to guess at. The second vice was the fall. The moss lay only 90 feet below the level of the workings, and the turnpike lay 440 feet below the moss, and the descent from the edge of the moss to the road at Marchant's Ford was made in a little under half a mile, which is a gradient of 1 in 6, and Wren observed, in the single sentence of the report that betrays any feeling whatever, that a loaded stone wagon upon a gradient of 1 in 6 is not a vehicle, but an accident awaiting a date. The second route was the western line, down to the Marl navigation at Fairwater Wharf, which was in principle the best of all, since the stone could have gone the whole way to Culverton by water at half the cost of land carriage. It required a descent of the western shoulder, which was practicable, 1.25 miles of new road across the holdings of 3 farmers, which was purchasable, and then the crossing of the River Lyde. There was no bridge. There had never been a bridge, because the Lyde in that reach ran in a wide gravelly flood plain and rose 11 feet in a wet February. And the only crossing was a ford which was impassable for 4 months in the year, and which no loaded wagon could have used in any month at all. Wren designed the bridge. He was too good a man not to. It is on the 3rd plan, a handsome 5-arch stone bridge with a flood arch at either end, and he priced it at £11,400, and then he wrote the sentence that made the whole design waste paper, which was that the bed and banks of the Lyde in that reach were vested by the Act of 1791 in the company of proprietors of the Marl Navigation, that the company's consent was required for any structure in or over the river, and that the company, having been applied to informally by him on the 11th of February, had replied that they would consent to no bridge whatever below Fairwater Lock, since the Duke's stone, if it reached the water at Fairwater, would be carried upon their canal at their tonnage, and if it reached the water below the lock, it would not. It was a monopoly answering a monopoly, and it was unanswerable, and it would have taken a private Act of Parliament and 3 years to overturn. The third route was the southern line, and it was the shortest of all, 1,100 yards from the first face, down the shallow gully at the south end of the edge, through the glebe land of the parish of Hallowbrook, past the west end of the churchyard, and out onto the turnpike at the village. Wren levelled it, and found the gradient acceptable. 1 in 19 at the worst. It required the purchase or lease of 6 acres of glebe, which is to say land belonging to the benefice, which could not be sold or leased for a term without the consent of the incumbent, the patron, the bishop, and the ecclesiastical commissioners, and which would in any event have carried 100 loaded stone wagons a day within 31 feet of the east window of a church in which divine service was performed twice on Sundays and once on Wednesdays. The Duke was the patron. The bishop, applied to, was not hostile. The incumbent was the Reverend Amos Whiteley. And the Reverend Amos Whiteley, when Halstead Grieve called upon him at the vicarage on the 26th of February, and explained, in the friendliest manner, what was wanted, sat quite still for a moment, and then said that he was very sorry, that he had a duty to the parish and to his successors, that the road would pass within a few feet of graves in which the parishioners' own people were lying, and that he could not and would not consent to it, and he said this to the agent of the man who held his living and who could have made his life a misery for 20 years. He was not a brave man in the ordinary sense. He was a nervous, untidy, kindly clergyman with a wife who wanted him to be a canon. He refused a duke because a young widow with no money had spent 11 weeks doing his tithe apportionment for nothing, and had never once asked him for anything in return, and because he had come, in consequence, to think of himself as a man who ought to behave decently. The vestry supported him on the 4th of March by 9 votes to 2. The fourth route was Sallow Lane. Wren's table on the 18th page set the 4 side by side. The northern line, £13,300, gradient 1 in 6, unusable in winter. The western line, £11,400 for the bridge alone, consent refused, no prospect of obtaining it under 3 years. The southern line, £2,200, consent refused by the incumbent and the vestry. Sallow Lane, £280 to repair the pitching and clear the side drains, gradient 1 in 23 at the worst, made ground already, walled on both sides, 1,180 yards from the top of the edge to the turnpike at Wexley Bar, available for use in every month of the year, and the freehold and soil of it, together with the wall upon the northern side, being vested by the award of 1798 in the owner, for the time being, of the messuage called Sallow End, which owner was at the date of the report Cordelia, Lady Crispin Straighton, widow, of Sallow End in the parish of Hallowbrook. Wren wrote that last clause without emphasis, in the same hand as the rest, and he did not editorialize, and he did not warn, and he did not suggest what should be done. He set down the fact. The report reached Ansford Court on the 4th of March, and on the 6th of March Ellis Wren received a letter from Halstead Grieve informing him that his services were no longer required, that the estate declined to accept the 18th page as it stood, and required it to be recast in a form which did not prejudge questions of title, and that upon receipt of an amended report, his account would be settled. Wren replied on the 7th, in 11 lines, that the 18th page contained nothing but the results of his own levels and a transcript of a public award enrolled with the clerk of the peace, that he could not amend a fact, that he begged to remain their obedient servant, and that his account for 42 guineas was enclosed. It was not paid for 14 months, and when it was paid under an order of the court. He went back to Sheffield on the 9th of March, and on his way to the coach he walked the 4 miles out to Sallow End, and knocked on the door, and told Cordelia Straighten what had happened, and left with her, quite deliberately, a fair copy of his book of levels and of the 18th page, made in his own hand, and signed and dated, which he was entitled to do because the estate had refused the report and had not paid for it. It was an act of some professional courage and a certain amount of anger. He was a man with no capital, 4 years in practice, and a reputation to build in a county where the great landowners talked to one another, and he had just been dismissed by a duke, and his response was to hand the duke's opponent the complete engineering proof of her case, and then get on a coach. He said afterwards that he had not thought of it as taking sides. He said that he had made the levels, and that the levels were true, and that a true thing belongs to whoever needs it. Cordelia read the 18th page standing in her own doorway, with the March wind coming up the lane, and then she folded it and put it in the tin box with Barnaby Oak's 61 letters and Tobias Lowndes' mark and the vicar's calendar of the parish chest, and she went inside and sat down by the fire, and for the first time in 2 years and 5 months, she allowed herself to think about the future in a serious way. £200 a month of liquidated damages, a contract for 120,000 tons, 40 men on the edge, 2 cranes, 11 wagons and £1,900 already in the ground. Deliveries beginning in the 2nd week of March, which was the following Tuesday. And 1 road down off the hill, 1,180 yards long and 27 feet wide between the walls, the soil and freehold whereof belonged to the woman they had laughed at in the small library, and every ton of it, every single ton of the 120,000, would have to cross her ground. The first loaded wagon came down Sallow Lane on the morning of Tuesday, the 12th of March, 1839, at 20 minutes past 7, and Cordelia heard it from her kitchen before she saw it, because a 4-ton wagon on pitched stone makes a sound like slow thunder, and the walls of the lane throw it forward. She went out and stood at her own gatepost in her apron, with a cup in her hand, and watched it come down past her. 3 horses and a driver walking at their heads, and a boy on the brake, and the driver, who was a Derbyshire man and knew nothing about anything, touched his hat to her civilly as he went by. 11 more came down before noon, 19 the next day, 31 on the Thursday. By the end of the first week, Josiah Braith had the traffic organized into a working system, up empty on the near side and down loaded on the off, and there was a watering trough put in at the second bend using her spring, and 2 men employed full time to fill the ruts, and by the end of the 2nd week, the lane, which had carried perhaps 40 vehicles, in the whole of the preceding 40 years, was carrying between 60 and 90 loaded wagons every working day, and the turf between the wheel tracks had gone, and the side drains that had lain, choked since the 1790s, had been opened out by the Duke's men. Because Braith knew his business, and knew that a road without drains is a road for one season only. Cordelia did not stop a single wagon. She did not stand in the road. She did not write to the newspapers. She did not consult a lawyer. And when Hetty Manders asked her, in the third week in a voice of pure anguish, whether the mistress was going to let them do it, Cordelia said that she was going to let them do it for a while, and went on turning the sleeve of her dress. What she did instead was count. She kept, from the 12th of March until the 11th of September, 1839, a tally of every loaded wagon that passed down Sallow Lane, and she kept it in a ruled book, by the day with the date, the weather, the number of loads before noon and the number after, and she took the weights from the weighing machine which the estate itself erected at the foot of the lane in the April, because the contractors paid by weight. She had, in fact, no need to guess at anything. The Duke of Ansford's own weighman sat in a hut on her ground and wrote down the tonnage of every wagon that crossed her boundary, and Cordelia, who walked past the hut every morning of her life on her way to the pump, was on excellent terms with him within a fortnight, and had the run of the book. His name was Kell. He was the same mild young man from the estate office who had let her look at the award plan in 1836, and he had been sent to the Weybridge as a punishment for a lost letter, and he thought Lady Crispin the only person connected with the family who had ever treated him as a human creature, and he let her copy his weekly totals every Saturday for 6 months without once asking himself whether he ought to. By the 11th of September, her book showed 22,941 tons. She waited until the 12th. On the 12th of September, 1839, being 6 months to the day from the first wagon, Cordelia Straighten walked into Wexley and paid an attorney named Corvin Slee 4 guineas to prepare and serve 3 documents. The first was a notice to the Duke of Ansford that the soil and freehold of the carriage road called Sallow Lane, together with the wall on the north side thereof, were vested in her, and that while she made no objection whatever to the passage of any person or vehicle in exercise of the public right of way, she gave notice that the user of the said rode by his grace and his servants for the carriage of stone from the quarries on Cranbeck Edge, being a user for the purposes of trade and amounting to an occupation of the soil, was made without her license, and would be charged for at the accustomed rate of 3d. the ton from the 12th day of March last. The second was a bill of particulars showing 22,941 tons at 3d, amounting to £286 15 shillings and 3d, together with a demand for the removal of the weighing machine, the watering trough, and the 2 huts erected upon her soil. The third was a formal notice to the same effect served upon Messrs. Beckwith and Sons, contractors, of Nottingham, informing them of the claim, of the title, and of the fact that every ton of stone delivered by them at the Culverton Works had crossed ground which the vendor did not own. That third document was the one that mattered, and it was entirely her own idea, and Corvin Slee advised against it. She served it because she understood, as no lawyer in Wexley then understood, that her opponent was not really the Duke of Ansford at all. Her opponent was a contract, and contracts have two ends. The reply came on the 19th. It came in the person of Halstead Grieve, on horseback at 11 in the morning, and he did not dismount at first, which Cordelia noticed and remembered. He said that his Grace had received a very extraordinary paper. He said that his Grace was disposed to overlook it in consideration of her situation and her connection with the family, and to treat it as the act of an ill-advised attorney rather than of a lady. He said that the estate had always understood the road to be part of the Hallowbrook lands, that the whole matter was one of the merest technicality, and that his Grace was willing, as an act of pure generosity, and without admitting anything whatever, to purchase her interest in the lane and the wall for the sum of £900, which he thought she would agree was a handsome price for a strip of grass, and which would place her in a position of comfort for the remainder of her life. £900. Cordelia stood at her gatepost, and behind her a loaded wagon came down the lane and the ground shook, and she waited until it had gone by, and then she asked Halstead Grieve to be so good as to tell his Grace that she was obliged to him, that she did not wish to sell the lane at any price, that her claim was for 3d the ton, and would continue at 3d the ton, and that the amount now due was £301 and some odd shillings, since a further 1,200 tons had passed since her bill was made out. Then she asked him, since he was there, to have the watering trough moved, because it was fed from her spring, and her house had gone short of water twice in August. Grieve, who was an able man, understood in that moment two things: that he was not dealing with a foolish woman, and that he was going to lose his place. He came down off the horse and tried for 20 minutes in the road to reason with her, and he was not offensive and he was not stupid, and he pointed out to her, quite correctly, that she had no money, that a suit in Chancery over a question of title could run 4 years and cost £800, that she would be ruined before she was heard, and that a duke could afford to be wrong for a very long time. She agreed with every word of it. She said that she had considered all of it, and that she was not going into Chancery, and that she had no intention of bringing any suit at all, and that she proposed simply to send in her bill every quarter day for as long as the stone came down, and to keep her tally, and to wait. He asked her what in God's name she supposed she was waiting for. She said that she was waiting for the 11th of September, 1841, which was the last day for delivery under the contract with Beckwith and Sons, and that if his Grace had not settled with her before that day, then upon that day he would have taken 120,000 tons of stone across the freehold of another person without license, and that the sum then due, at 3d the ton, would be £1,500, and that a debt of £1,500 is not a technicality, but an action at law upon which she would have no difficulty in finding somebody to advance the costs, and that meanwhile every month the amount grew and the evidence grew and the witnesses grew, and that she had nothing to do all day but count wagons and he had a viaduct to build. Then she wished him good morning and went in and shut the door. The estate's answer to that came in the October, and it was the cleverest thing anybody at Ansford Court did in the whole affair, and it very nearly worked. The estate did not deny that the soil was hers. Pethering, who had by then been consulted, and who had recognized his own handwriting in the schedule with feelings that can be imagined, advised a different course altogether, which was to admit the soil and to claim the right. The Duke of Ansford, so the case ran, was the owner of the quarries and getting grounds upon Cranbeck Edge. Those quarries had been worked from time immemorial. The way from those quarries to the highway had been used for the carriage of stone as of right, openly and without interruption, for as long as men could remember, and such a user creates in law an easement appurtenant to the quarries which passes with them, and which no owner of the soil can defeat, so that the Duke required no license from anybody, and owed nothing to anybody, and might cart 1,000,000 tons down that lane, if he pleased. It was, as a proposition of law, entirely sound. It was supported by every practical fact on the ground, by the pitched bottoming and the culvert and the side drains and the 1,700 yards of stone wall, by the very antiquity that Cordelia had spent 2 years establishing. And to make it good, and to put the parish's authority behind it, the estate applied at the Wexley Special Sessions on the 14th of October, 1839, for an order that Sallow Lane be entered upon the parish list as a public carriage highway repairable by the inhabitants at large, and be widened and repaired accordingly at the charge of the rate. The 2 justices sitting were the chairman of the division and Mr. Fenwick Straighton, the Duke's cousin, and the application was granted in 9 minutes, and Cordelia Straighton, sitting at the back of the room in her black bonnet with her tally book on her knee, watched it granted, and did not say one word, and went home along her own lane in the rain, and was seen by Hetty Manders to be smiling. She was smiling because the Duke of Ansford had just sworn, upon a public record, before 2 justices of the peace, one of them his own cousin, that the carriage of stone down Sallow Lane was an ancient right enjoyed from time immemorial. That was the whole of it. A man who claims an easement by prescription claims it as it was anciently enjoyed, with every condition and every burden that attached to the enjoyment, and he cannot pick up the right and leave the burden lying in the grass. There was in existence exactly one document in the world which described how the carriage of stone down that lane had anciently been enjoyed, and it was 2 feet of parchment in the parish chest at Hallowbrook, calendared and listed and lodged in duplicate with the diocesan registry 18 months before anybody at Ansford Court had a motive to wish it elsewhere, and it said that all men might use the same paying to the Lord's tenant at Sallow End for every wain of stone the accustomed toll. The estate had spent the autumn proving her case for her at its own expense. She had never had to argue that the right was ancient. Her opponent had insisted upon it. The vestry of Hallowbrook appealed against the sessions order at the Epiphany Quarter Sessions of 1840, on the plain and unanswerable ground that the inhabitants at large of a poor parish of 640 souls should not be rated to repair a road that was being destroyed by 90-loaded stone wagons a day for the private profit of 1 man. And the appeal was entered by the Reverend Amos Whiteley as chairman of the vestry, and the costs of it, which came to £51, were raised by subscription in the parish, and 11 of the £51 were subscribed by farmers who had never in their lives given a penny to anything. That was the second thing the family had failed to calculate. They had thought of Cordelia Straighton as a solitary and eccentric woman in a damp house. They had not observed that she had spent 3 years doing the tithe apportionment for nothing, sitting up 2 nights with the smith's wife in her confinement, writing letters for people who could not write, and paying 11 shillings a year in tobacco to an old carter, and that the parish, which had begun by laughing at her along with everybody else, had ended by regarding her as its own. When the appeal came on at the county town on the 9th of January, 1840, the road from Hallowbrook was black with carts. The appeal was heard for 2 days, and it was in form a dispute about rates, and in substance the first public examination of the history of Sallow Lane, and the evidence given upon it was afterwards the foundation of everything. Counsel for the vestry, instructed for 11 guineas, put in the highway surveyor's account book, the vestry minutes of 1792 to 1796, the enclosure award of 1798, the calendared parchment of 1631, the signed and witnessed statement of the late Tobias Lound, the evidence of Ned Tarver the smith, and of Peg Sowerby, and the book of levels and 18th page of Mr. Ellis Wren, mineral surveyor of Sheffield, who attended and was examined for 2 hours and 35 minutes, and who was, by the account of everyone present, the best witness anybody in that court had ever heard, because he answered only what he was asked, admitted at once everything that told against his side, and could not be moved a hair's breadth upon a figure. The quarter sessions quashed the order. They held that the way was a private carriage road with a public right of foot and horse passage over it, that the soil was in the owner of Sallow End under the award, that the extraordinary user by the quarries was not a highway matter at all, and that the parish should not be rated 1 farthing. The Duke of Ansford paid the costs of both sides, which came to £290, and read in the county newspaper of the 11th of January a report of the proceedings occupying a column and a half, in which the phrase "a lane and a wall" appeared twice, and not, this time, at Cordelia's expense. It was in that same month that she found the field book. She had kept her father's 41 field books in a nailed deal case under the stair at Sallow End since 1836, and she had gone through 11 of them in the first winter looking for Hallowbrook and had found nothing, and had stopped, because the case was heavy and the light was bad and she had hens to feed. In the January of 1840, being unable to sleep after the sessions, she took the case out and went through the whole of the remaining 30, one by one, at the kitchen table, over 4 nights. The 14th book was for the year 1811. Her father had been 34. He had been employed, the entries showed, by the trustees acting under the will of the 4th Duke of Ansford, to survey and value the mineral and getting grounds upon Cranbeck Edge in the parish of Hallowbrook, with a view to a proposed sale, and he had spent 19 days upon the ground in the August and September of that year, and he had booked every measurement, and he had drawn the section of the bed, and he had written at the end of it a valuation in his own hand, of which he had evidently sent a fair copy to the trustees, and of which the draft with his workings ran to 5 pages. On the 4th of those pages, under the head of deductions, Nathaniel Tarrant had written that the getting grounds were of good stone and well placed, but that the whole of the produce must be carried down by the walled cartway to the Wexley Turnpike, there being no other practicable descent, and that upon the said cartway there was payable to the owner of the messuage, called Sallow End, the accustomed toll of 3d. the ton for stone, and 1 penny the ton for lime, which toll, though not lately demanded by reason of the disuse of the quarries, was of record in the manor, and had been paid within living memory, and that the value of the getting grounds must be reduced accordingly. It was the Duke of Ansford's own family, through the Duke of Ansford's own trustees at the Duke of Ansford's own expense in 1811, recording as a deduction from the value of their own property the exact toll that the Duke of Ansford was now refusing to pay. Cordelia sat at the table until the candle went out and then sat in the dark. She was not thinking about money. She was thinking that her father, who had died, believing that he had left his daughter comfortable, and who would have been very unhappy indeed if he had lived to see the small library at Ansford Court, had walked over Cranbeck Edge with a chain in the August of 1811, and had written down the truth about a road, in his ordinary careful hand, for a fee of 11 guineas, 28 years before it was wanted, and had put it in a deal case, and forgotten it. He had never once been able to write down a thing that was not so. It had cost him a great deal of work in his lifetime. It had now made his daughter's fortune, and she put her hand flat upon the page in the dark, and said thank you aloud, which was the second time in 3 years she had spoken to somebody who was not there. From that night the affair moved fast. She wrote to Ellis Wren in Sheffield, who came over within the week, and who took the field book to a Sheffield attorney of his acquaintance named Prosper Halliwell, a shrewd, unfashionable, immensely industrious man, who did the business of half the collieries in the district, and who had no reverence whatever for dukes. Halliwell read the 14th field book, and the tin box, and the 18th page, and the 61 letters of Barnaby Oak, and then he asked Cordelia one question, which was whether she was prepared to be talked about, and she said that she had been talked about since 1836, and had found that she survived it, and Halliwell said that in that case he would take her business. He took it, moreover, upon terms that were then irregular and are now ordinary. She mortgaged Sallow End to Barnaby Oak for £250 at 4 per centum, which Oak would have given her outright, and which she insisted upon taking as a business loan with a deed and an endorsement of interest, and Halliwell agreed to carry the remainder of the costs and to be paid out of the recovery. And then, before he issued a single writ, Prosper Halliwell did the thing which showed that he had understood his client. He wrote to Messrs. Beckwith and Sons of Nottingham. The letter, dated the 4th of February, 1840, set out the title, enclosed a certified copy of the award and of the 1631 presentment, recited the Sessions decision of the 9th of January, and observed that in these circumstances the whole of the stone delivered to them at the Culverton Works had been brought to them across land in which the vendor had no interest, and in respect of which a debt was accruing, and that his client would in due course be advised to look to the purchasers as well as to the vendor. Beckwith and Sons were building a 24-arch viaduct 92 feet high on a contract of their own with a railway company, and they had £112,000 at stake, and a board of Nottingham hosiers behind them, and their reply to that letter took 4 days, and consisted of a notice to the Duke of Ansford that they were retaining out of the moneys payable to him under the stone contract the sum of £2,000, to be held against the claim of Lady Crispin Straighten until it should be discharged or determined. The Duke of Ansford learned, on the 11th of February, 1840, that £2,000 of his money was being held back by a firm of tradesmen on account of a widow with £60 a year, to whom his mother had given a lane and a wall. The Dowager Duchess of Ansford came to Sallow End on the 29th of February, 1840, in a closed carriage with 2 footmen, and she came without notice at 3 in the afternoon, and she could not get her carriage up to the door, because the door of Sallow End opened into the lane, and the lane at 3 in the afternoon on a working day was full of loaded stone wagons going down. She was obliged to leave the carriage at the turnpike and walk 60 yards up her own son's quarry road on the arm of a footman, in a March wind, past a weighbridge hut and a watering trough and a heap of roadstone, and she arrived at the door of the 4-roomed house in a temper that she had entirely under control, which in that woman was a much worse thing. Cordelia received her in the kitchen, because there was no fire in the parlor, and she was not going to light one. She gave her the chair with the cushion. She made tea in the cracked white pot, and put a plate of bread and butter upon the table, and sat down opposite the Dowager Duchess of Ansford with her hands folded, and waited. She was 26 years old. She had on the same black dress, turned for the 3rd time, and there was road dust on the window and the sound of iron tires in the lane outside, and the 2 women looked at one another across a deal table for the first time since the small library. The Dowager began kindly. She always did. She said that she had been distressed to hear that dear Cordelia had fallen into the hands of attorneys, that lawyers were the ruin of women and of families, that this whole unhappy business had arisen from a misunderstanding which any 2 people of goodwill could settle in 10 minutes, and that she had come herself, at her age and in this weather, because she believed that it ought to be settled between the family and not between hired men. She said that the Duke was prepared to be generous. She said that he would pay £2,000 down for the freehold of the lane and the wall, that he would in addition raise the annuity from £60 to £150 for life, and that a house would be found for her at Marchant's Ford, a very pretty house with a south aspect, so that she need not spend another winter in this place, and that in return she would give up the lane and sign a release of all claims, and let the family hear no more of threepences. And then, because she could not help it, and because in the whole of her 71 years nothing had ever taught her that she could not, the Dowager Duchess added that she hoped dear Cordelia understood how very unbecoming the whole thing had been, and how much it distressed the Duke to see his brother's widow standing at a gatepost counting carts like a toll-keeper's wife. Cordelia poured the tea. She said that she was obliged for the offer, and that she declined it. She said that she would not sell the lane for £2,000 or for £20,000, because the lane was not a thing to be sold, but a thing to be let, and that she had no wish to be given a pretty house at Marchant's Ford, and that she was tolerably comfortable where she was. And then, since the subject had been raised, and since she had waited 3 years and 5 months for the opportunity, she said one thing more, and she said it in the flattest voice she possessed, without heat, in the manner of a person reading out a measurement. She said that on the 14th of September, 1834, in the vestry of Hallowbrook Church, a deed had been executed, which was not the deed that had been read over to her and to her trustee in the small library in the September, that the parcels in the second schedule had been changed, and the jointure reduced from £100 to 60, that she had the draft and the engrossment, and 61 letters passing between Mr. Barnaby Oak and Messrs. Pethering and Slade between the June and the September of 1834, in which the farm called Ray and the lands called the Nether Hollands were named 11 times, that she had never made any complaint of it to any human being, and had never intended to, and that if the family should at any time hereafter find it convenient to describe her in a court of law or in a county newspaper as a grasping woman, she would put the whole of that correspondence into the hands of Mr. Prosper Halliwell within the hour. It was, she said, not a threat, because she was not asking for anything in exchange for silence and did not want Ray Farm and had no intention of ever mentioning the matter again. It was simply a fact about the world, of the same kind as the gradient of the lane, and the Duchess might do with it what she liked. The Dowager Duchess of Ansford sat quite still for a long moment. Then she said, in an entirely different voice, without any sweetness at all, that Cordelia had grown very like her father. Cordelia said that she took that as the greatest compliment she had ever been paid, and would the Duchess have some bread and butter? The Dowager did not have any bread and butter. She went away down the lane on her footman's arm between two loaded wagons, and she never spoke to her daughter-in-law again as long as she lived, and she also never, from that afternoon to the end of the business, permitted one word to be said against Cordelia Straiton in her hearing by any member of her family or household, which was the only apology she was capable of making. The action was commenced on the 18th of March, 1840, in the Court of Exchequer, Straiton, widow, against His Grace the Duke of Ansford, in trespass, for the taking and carrying of stone over the plaintiff's soil, damages laid at £3,000. It was set down for trial at the summer assizes. It never reached a jury, and the reason it never reached a jury is the most instructive thing in the whole history. On the 2nd of June the Duke's counsel, having read the brief, advised in the plainest terms that the defence could not succeed. The estate had already asserted the ancient right at the special sessions, and had lost the highway point at quarter sessions, and could not now be heard to say that the user was modern. If the right was ancient, the conditions of the ancient user came with it. The only record of those conditions was the manorial presentment of 1631, which was calendared, attested and beyond suspicion, and which fixed the toll at 3d. the ton. And if by any chance the court should hold the presentment insufficient, there remained the valuation made by Nathaniel Tarrant in 1811 for the defendant's own trustees, which recited the same toll in the same figure, and which was, as counsel observed in a sentence that was quoted in Lincoln's Inn for 20 years, an admission by the defendant's own title, paid for by the defendant's own money, and locked in the defendant's own muniment room, of which the plaintiff happens to hold the surveyor's draft, because the surveyor happened to be her father. Counsel added that in his opinion a jury of the county, having heard that the plaintiff was the widow of the defendant's brother, that she had been provided for with a strip of grass, and that she had for 3 years lived upon £60 a year at the foot of the road, out of which the defendant was making £41,000, would give her every farthing she asked, and would probably add to it, and that his advice was to refer the whole matter to arbitration before it could be reported in the newspapers. It was referred by consent on the 11th of June, 1840, to a single arbitrator, a sergeant at law of great experience, named Fulbright, with power to determine the rights of the parties and to fix a rate and a term. The reference sat for 6 days at the county town in the July. Cordelia attended every day of it, alone, in the same black dress, with her tally book and her father's field book in a canvas bag on her knee, and she gave evidence for 4 hours and 40 minutes on the third day, and was cross-examined for 2.5 hours by a very able man who was paid 100 guineas to shake her, and who did not shake her, because every figure she was asked for she had written down at the time, with the date and the weather, and every document she was asked about she had lodged somewhere public a year or more before anybody knew she would need it. When he put it to her, at the end, that she had lain in wait for 3 years like a spider, she agreed that she had waited 3 years, and said that she had waited because she had had no money to do anything else, and that if His Grace had offered her £100 a year in the March of 1839, she would have taken it and been grateful, and that the reason he had not offered it was that in the March of 1839 he had not yet found out that he needed her. There was, the local paper reported, some laughter in court, and the arbitrator did not check it. Sergeant Fulbright published his award on the 4th of August, 1840. It is 11 pages long, and it is a model of its kind, and the substance of it can be given in a few sentences. He found that the soil and freehold of the carriage road called Sallow Lane, and of the dry stone wall of 900 yards upon the northern side thereof, were vested in the plaintiff under the award of 1798. He found that there subsisted over the said road a public right of passage, which the plaintiff had never disputed and could not defeat. He found that there subsisted also, appurtenant to the quarries and getting grounds upon Cranbeck Edge, an ancient right of carriageway for stone, as the defendant had himself asserted at the special sessions of the 14th of October, 1839. And he found, upon the presentment of the manorial jury of 1631, upon the evidence of the surveyor of highways accounts, upon the attested statement of the late Tobias Lound, and upon the valuation made by Nathaniel Tarrant for the defendant's own trustees in 1811, that the said ancient right had always been enjoyed subject to the payment to the owner of the messuage called Sallow End of the accustomed toll of 3d. For every ton of stone, and 1 penny for every ton of lime, and that the defendant, having claimed the right, took it with the burden. He therefore awarded that the defendant do pay to the plaintiff, in respect of the stone already carried between the 12th of March, 1839, and the date of the reference, being 51,204 tons, as shown by the defendant's own Weybridge books, the sum of £640 and 1 shilling. He awarded £26 for the 40 yards of the plaintiff's wall, which had been thrown down in the April of 1839 to form a passing place, and directed that the wall be rebuilt to its former height and coping at the defendant's charge within 6 months. He awarded the removal of the huts and the watering trough, or their retention, at a rent of £4 a year at the plaintiff's option. And he awarded, in place of any further litigation, a term that the defendant, his heirs and assigns, should have the free and uninterrupted use of the said road for the carriage of stone from Cranbeck Edge for a term of 21 years from Michaelmas 1840, paying to the plaintiff, her heirs and assigns, 3d. For every ton so carried, with a minimum payment of £500 in every year of the term whether the stone were carried or not, the same to be a rent charge upon the quarries and to be recoverable by distress. 40,000 tons a year at 3d. the ton is £500. Ellis Wren had done that arithmetic in 4 seconds at a kitchen table on the 4th of February, 1839, sitting opposite a woman who had eaten bread and dripping for her dinner, and the sergeant-at-law now wrote it into an award under his hand and seal 18 months later, and it became, on Michaelmas Day 1840, the income of Cordelia Straiton. £500 a year guaranteed for 21 years, being £10,500 in the whole, secured upon the very stone that the family had been sitting on for 400 years, without once troubling to ask how it was to get down the hill. And because the contract with Beckwith and Sons ran to 120,000 tons, and the quarry went on working long after it, the tonnage in 11 of those 21 years exceeded the minimum, and the actual sum received by her over the term was rather more than £13,000. She had brought £6,000 into that family, and had been given in exchange a lane and a wall. The lane and the wall paid her back, with interest twice over. The £2,000 retained by Beckwith and Sons was released in the September, and paid to the Duke of Ansford, less £666 paid direct to Prosper Halliwell for the plaintiff. The mortgage on Sallow End was discharged in the October, and Barnaby Oak, presented with £250 and £11 4 of interest by a young woman who insisted upon a receipt, went out into the lane and cried, which he had not done since his wife died. Halstead Grieve left the estate at Lady Day 1841 and went into partnership at Derby, and did rather well, and always said afterwards that the best advice he had ever given in his life was the letter he had written to a Sheffield surveyor, and that he had been dismissed for it in everything but name. Josiah Braith stayed on Cranbeck Edge for 19 years, and employed at the height of it 140 men, and the village of Hallowbrook, which had 640 souls in 1839, had 911 at the census of 1851, and a school, and a chapel, and a second shop. The Reverend Amos Whiteley was never made a canon. Cordelia paid for the restoration of his chancel roof in 1844 out of 1 year's toll, on condition that no tablet was put up about it, and there is none. The Duke of Ansford paid his threepences quarterly for 21 years, or rather his agents did, and he never once mentioned the matter aloud after the August of 1840, and he died in 1853 with the mortgage reduced by £61,000, because the quarry that had nearly ruined him made him, in the end, a very great deal of money, and it made him that money entirely, because a widow had refused £2,000, and had insisted upon being paid by the ton for 21 years, which meant that the stone kept moving, and the account kept running, and nobody at Ansford Court was ever again permitted to be casual about the road. His son, the 7th Duke, called upon Cordelia at Sallow End in 1846, and was received in the parlour, which by then had a fire in it, and asked her advice about the drainage of the home farm, and took it. She did not move to a pretty house at Marchant's Ford. She stayed at Sallow End for the rest of her life, and she spent the first year's toll upon the roof, the gutter, and the pump, and the second upon the garden, and the third upon buying, from a farmer who was glad to be rid of it, the 11 acres of rough ground on the north side of her wall, so that she should own both sides of her own lane. She rebuilt the 40 yards of wall herself with a waller from Hallowbrook, and she had the coping laid in the old pattern to match, and she set into the gatepost at the foot of the lane a plain gritstone tablet, cut by a mason at Wexley for £1.15, which gave the toll, for every ton of stone, 3d, for every ton of lime, 1 penny, for foot passengers, horses, and all persons going about their lawful business. Nothing. It is still there. And in the November of 1841, at Hallowbrook Church, with Barnaby Oak giving her away, and the whole vestry in the pews and Hetty Manders in a new bonnet, Cordelia Straiton married Ellis Wren. It had taken them 2 years and 9 months, and it had been conducted almost entirely by letter and by the exchange of levels, and there had never at any point been a declaration of the kind that occurs in novels. What had happened was that a man had knelt in a ditch in a sleet storm and had been handed a brass screw by a woman who told him his line was wrong, and had gone away and thought about it, and had come back, and had gone on coming back for 2 years, and had at last written to her in the September of 1841 a letter of 11 lines, of which the operative sentence was that he had no fortune, no connections, and a practice worth 200 a year. That he was aware she was now a woman of independent means, and that this made his asking a piece of impertinence, and that he was asking notwithstanding, because he had been unable to survey a field for 2 years without wondering what she would have said about the drainage. She wrote back the same day. Her letter was 4 lines long, and the operative sentence was that she had married once for kindness, and once was not enough. They had 3 children. She kept her tally books, all of them, and her father's 41 field books, and the tin box, and the 14th book with the 1811 valuation in it, lay in the bottom of the case until 1868, when her eldest son, who was by then in practice with his father, took it out to settle a dispute about a right-of-way in another county, and won it. That is the whole of the history, and there is one thing more to be said about it, which is the thing that Cordelia herself used to say, in later years, when people who had heard the story asked her, as they always did, whether she had known all along. She had not. She had known nothing all along. On the wet afternoon in the small library at Ansford Court, when a dowager duchess with a small dog on her knee said that a lane and a wall were quite as much as anybody could reasonably have looked for, and 3 women laughed, Cordelia Straiton had possessed no secret knowledge and no plan and no expectation of anything whatever except a cold house and £60 a year. What she had possessed was a habit, taught to her by a saddler's son who walked 1,100 parishes with a chain over his shoulder, of asking of any piece of ground 2 questions that hardly anybody in the world ever bothers to ask. Where does it go? And who else can get there? The Duke of Ansford owned 1,100 acres of stone on the top of Cranbeck Edge, and 2 million tons standing in it, and 40 men, and 2 cranes, and a contract worth £1,000. Cordelia Straiton owned 1,180 yards of walled road, 27 feet wide, running down the only practicable line off that hill, and 1,400 tons of dry stone wall along the north side of it. They had given it to her as a joke because it looked like nothing, and it looked like nothing because nobody at Ansford Court had ever once walked up it. 40,000 tons of their stone a year came down it for 21 years, and every single ton of it crossed her ground, and every single ton of it was counted, and paid for at 3 pence.